December 13th, 1943, Assam Valley, India. The sky is so clear it almost looks harmless. Far below, the tea fields, rivers, and dusty roads of the Brahmaputra Valley stretch out like a map. In the middle of it all lies Nagaghuli airfield, hard-packed strip, fuel dumps, tents, and the thin, silver lines of transports climbing away toward the Himalayas and the Hump. High above them, a single P-40N Warhawk carves a lazy arc through the haze. Her name is Lulu Belle. Skull painted on the nose, whitewall tires on the landing gear, 650 caliber guns in the wings. In the cockpit sits Second Lieutenant Philip Adair of the 89th Fighter Squadron, Burma Banshees. He's flown more than 40 combat missions out here, but today was supposed to be a simple patrol. Up, out over the valley, back home in time to gripe about the coffee. Then ground control's voice crackled in his headphones. Bandits inbound, Vector 310, initial estimate, small formation. Now Adair squints into the sun where the controller's bearing points. At first he sees exactly what they told him to expect. 4 tiny black specks, far out, level with the horizon. He pushes Lulu Belle a little higher, a little closer. The specks grow. 4 dots resolve into 4 shapes with wings. Then, suddenly, each one of those 4 planes blossoms in his mind into something much worse. They're not 4 aircraft. They're 4 full elements of bombers, with a cloud of fighter escorts riding shotgun. Adair's gut goes cold. Below him is his home base and the lifeline of the Hump. Ahead of him is a Japanese raid that might be 60 planes strong, and he is the only Allied fighter in the air. What was forming in front of Adair wasn't just another dogfight. It was a direct threat to the one thing the Allies in this forgotten corner of the war could not afford to lose. Assam wasn't famous like Normandy or Midway. It was mud, heat, and endless work. Maintenance crews, radio operators, and transport pilots flying a route everyone simply called the Hump. From these fields, unarmed C-47s and C-46s clawed their way over the Himalayas into China, hauling fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to keep Chinese armies and American units there in the fight. If the Hump bases died, that lifeline died with them. Nagaghuli, Chabua, Dinjan. Names barely known back home were the beating heart of that air bridge. The Japanese knew it. They had been probing the valley for weeks. A few bombers here, a handful of fighters there, testing radar coverage, feeling out how fast the defenders scrambled, how high and from which direction they preferred to attack. Some raids turned back at the last minute. Others dropped scattered bombs and ran. Irritating, but not decisive. Intelligence kept whispering that a bigger strike was coming. The 80th Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees, had been sent in to make sure that when it came, someone would be there to meet it. Their P-40Ns were tough, heavy-hitting fighters with shark-like lines and skulls grinning on their noses. They weren't elegant, compared to the nimble Japanese Ki-43. Oscar, the Warhawk, was a bruiser, faster in a dive, sturdier, better armed, but slower to climb and turn. Every pilot in the group knew the joke. Try to climb with an Oscar, and you're writing your own epitaph. So their tactics were built around what the P-40 did best. Hit hard, hit fast, and dive away. Use speed and surprise, not aerobatic finesse. Stay away from swirling dogfights at altitude where the Japanese fighters could dance around you. On paper, that was the plan. Multiple flights of P-40s rising together to meet any major raid, working in pairs and fours, never letting themselves get isolated. In reality, on this clear December morning, things hadn't lined up perfectly. Patrols had landed. Others were scattered on missions. Maintenance and refueling had thinned the ready line. When the big raid finally showed up over Assam, the timing was cruel. The only fighter already in position, already at altitude, was Lulu Belle, and the man strapped into her seat. Adair's morning had already been long before the sky turned ugly. A few hours earlier, he'd taken Lulu Belle out on a routine patrol over the Hump route. Just another mission number on a long board of missions. 4 P-40s climbing out, checking the usual choke points, listening to the same static-filled radio chatter. Nothing. No contacts. Just empty blue and the distant white wall of the Himalayas. They'd come back, low on fuel and high on boredom. While his wingmen shut down and headed for breakfast, Adair stayed on the line, fussing over his airplane with his crew chief, Peak, topping off ammo, checking oil, making sure the skull on the nose still looked properly menacing. He was both flight leader and assistant engineering officer. If anything on Lulu Belle rattled, he wanted to know why. That's when the siren started to wail. The red alert cut through the usual background noise like a knife. Mechanics sprinted for sandbagged shelters. Transport pilots dove for their cockpits. Peak was still tightening a panel when Adair grabbed his helmet, scrambled up the wing, and dropped into the P-40's seat. Scramble, scramble. Bandits inbound, bearing 310. Estimate 4 aircraft. 4. Annoying, but manageable. Probably another probing raid, he thought. Bombers feeling out the defenses, maybe with a couple of escorts. He firewalled the throttle, felt Lulu Belle surge forward, and was airborne in a blur of dust and vibration. As he climbed, he could see the valley spread out in miniature. Nagaghuli below, fuel drums stacked like toy blocks, the thin silver shapes of transports taking off for China. Somewhere under that haze were mess halls, sleeping tents, a hospital, and men who assumed the warning siren would end like most did, with distant thunder and no real harm done. Up here, the picture was changing. The radar room's 4 planes resolved into more shapes, more wings, more glints of sunlight. The closer he got, the more wrong that initial estimate felt. This wasn't a probing jab. It was a full-sized hammer coming down on his home. The closer Adair got, the worse the math became. What had looked like 4 aircraft were now clearly 4 elements of bombers, lines of twin-engined Ki-21, Sallies, steady and purposeful, stacked across the sky. Above and around them drifted their escorts, Ki-43. Oscar fighters, light and agile, exactly the kind of opponent a P-40 pilot didn't want to meet on equal terms. He did a quick count and stopped bothering after 60. "Control, this is Lulu Belle lead," he called, trying to keep his voice level. "Correction on that raid. Looks like 24 bombers, maybe 30, plus at least that many fighters. They're setting up to bomb the valley now." Down in the radar cabin, officers began frantically updating boards and yelling for every available fighter to scramble. But Adair could see the angles they couldn't. The bombers were already turning into their run. Even if more P-40s got airborne immediately, they'd be late to the party. He hung there above and behind the formation, safe for the moment in a thin slice of empty sky, and realized he had a choice. He could stay put, circle out of range, provide reports and watch the bombs march across his own airfields, fuel dumps, and friends. Or he could dive alone into a hornet's nest. He thought about doctrine, about odds, about the P-40's limitations. Then he thought about Peak on the ground, the transport pilots loading for the Hump, The medics in the hospital tents with no idea what was coming. Decision made. He picked his target. The bombers, not the fighters. Knock a fighter or two down and the raid still succeeds. Rattle the bomber boxes at just the wrong moment, and hundreds of bombs might go wide. In his head, he built the whole attack and escape in seconds. He'd come in from high and off to the side, fire early to spook the lead elements, then rake through the rear box where the formation was sloppiest. And when the escorts dove on him, as they surely would, he would not climb, turn, or try to dogfight. He would shove the stick full forward and over, dump Lulu Belle into a -G outside roll, and dive straight out of their trap at terminal speed. Every manual said that kind of move, surrounded by enemy fighters, was suicide. Adair tightened his harness, thumbed his gun switches on, and pointed the skull-nosed P-40 at the center of the formation anyway. Adair eased the throttle forward and let gravity start to work. From his perch above and behind the formation, the Japanese raid looked almost neat. 4 tidy bomber boxes, escorts drifting around them like watchful sharks. The neatness lasted right up until he rolled Lulu Belle onto her side and pointed her nose at their leader. The P-40 picked up speed fast. The steady drone of the Allison engine turned into a rising howl. The bomber formation swelled in his windscreen, shapes turning into airplanes, airplanes into individual panels and gun blisters. He could see the glass in the nose of the lead Ki-21 now, and the tiny silhouette of the bombardier inside. He opened fire early. At that range, no manual would have called it a smart shot, but he wasn't hunting a clean kill. He was hunting nerves. Lines of bright .50 caliber tracers lanced out ahead of him, streaking across the lead bomber's nose and through the air just in front of the others. The effect was immediate. The front box twitched just a little, bombers bobbing out of perfect formation as pilots flinched. The second element wobbled to avoid them. The smooth, level attack run began to ripple. Adair held the trigger down and slid his aim into the next group, walking fire from nose to engines. Then he kicked rudder, rolled right, and dropped behind the last box on the far side. At this range, his guns did more than scare. He raked the tail-end sally from wingtip to cockpit, saw flashes along the left engine, a brief lick of flame. Then he was through them, out the far side, alone again, with open sky ahead. That's when every escort fighter in the world seemed to show up. Oscars rolled in from above, from the sides, from behind. Green and brown shapes with rising sun roundels flashed across his mirrors, cutting in to bracket him. The back of his neck prickled. He could almost feel the invisible lines connecting their gun sights to his canopy. Time for the suicide move. Without giving himself room to second-guess it, Adair shoved the stick full forward and over into the left corner. For an instant, his stomach tried to climb through his throat. The -G ripped him against his straps. The horizon flipped crazily as Lulu Belle snapped into an outside roll and then pitched into a steep, screaming dive. Tracers slashed the air where he'd been a heartbeat before. Most of the Oscars overshot, unwilling or unable to follow an inverted, diving P-40 straight down into thicker air. The altimeter spun. 15,000 feet. 10,000. 8,000. The valley rushed up to meet him. Adair gritted his teeth, pulled the stick back, and felt the controls stiffen as the air thickened. The Warhawk groaned, but leveled out a few hundred feet above the jungle. He stole a glance back. The fighters were tiny specks again, reforming around the bombers. They hadn't chased him. They couldn't afford to. Their job was to guard the formation, not hunt a single crazy American into the weeds. He'd punched a hole in the attack run, but the raid was still coming. Adair shoved the throttle forward again and began to climb, low and behind the formation, using cloud wisps and haze to mask his approach. His arms ached from the G-load. Sweat stung his eyes. In the cockpit, the clock ticked. From his first burst to his escape dive, maybe a minute had passed. He was going back in. This time, the Oscars were ready. As he closed, the bomber box was a little looser, the formation roughened from his first pass. But every fighter that could see him turned in. It looked like every Jap in the sky suddenly pointed at me, he'd later write. He dove straight through them. No fancy dogfighting, no turning contests, just pure deflection shooting, snap bursts at crossing targets, short dashes and dives whenever an Oscar tried to saddle up behind him. He saw one fighter's engine cough and trail smoke, another drop its gear as if the pilot was losing control. He didn't wait to see them fall. Staying to admire your handiwork was a good way to die. Somewhere in that chaotic blur, the Japanese finally scored. Rounds smacked into Lulu Belle's fuselage, one hitting close enough behind his head to send a tongue of flame licking around the armor plate. The cockpit filled with the stink of burned paint and cordite. The controls grew heavy and unresponsive. When he tried to climb away again, the nose kept wanting to drop. He hauled back on the stick with both hands and realized the trim was jammed full nose down. At low altitude now, engine laboring, he spotted an Oscar limping ahead, the one he thought he'd hit. He lined up behind it, thumbed the trigger. Nothing. The guns were dry. He yanked the P-40 away to avoid ramming the Japanese fighter outright and felt tracers whip past his wing in return. Somehow, miraculously, nothing vital was hit. He needed altitude, and his elevator wanted him in the ground. So he did something no pilot handbook had ever suggested. He rolled Lulu Belle upside down. Suddenly, the nose-down trim became nose-up. Inverted, the wounded P-40 climbed when he eased forward on the stick. He nursed her up in an upside-down stagger, then rolled upright to glide, then inverted again, an awkward seesaw rhythm of survival. On the ground, men would later swear they saw a skull-nosed P-40 circling home with its wheels on top. Behind him, the Japanese bombs finally fell, scattered ragged, many of them splashing harmlessly into fields and river flats. The raid did damage, but nowhere near what a calm, undisturbed run would have done. All of that, 2 attacks, a suicidal dive, a running fight, and an upside-down escape, had taken about 3 minutes. On paper, the December 13th raid goes down as just one of many clashes over the Assam Valley. In the memory of the men who lived there, it feels bigger. The official squadron report would later describe Adair's action in clipped military language. One P-40 intercepting a formation of roughly 24 bombers and 30-odd fighters, damaging several bombers and fighters, returning with a heavily shot-up aircraft. It notes that the bomb pattern on Nagaghuli and the surrounding fields fell short and wide of the main targets. What the paperwork doesn't capture is the view from the ground. Transport pilots watched the bombs walk across open fields instead of the runway. Medics saw them explode in paddies instead of among their tents. Fuel dumps that should have been pillars of fire remained stubbornly unlit. People on the base only learned later that, for a few long minutes, there had been exactly 1 American fighter between them and a storm of high explosive. Within the Burma Banshees, Adair's mission became a kind of legend. Training briefings started to mention it by name. New pilots heard about the day a single P-40 Dove, a bomber formation, escaped a swarm of fighters with a suicide negative G roll and came home inverted because the trim was shot out. It was a reminder that the P-40, flown within its strengths and sometimes just beyond them, could still change the outcome of a battle. Philip Adair didn't become a household name ace. He finished the war the way most real heroes do, quietly with a long logbook and a battered flight jacket. He went on to fly a total of 139 combat missions in P-40s and P-47s, eventually retiring as a colonel. But when people asked him decades later about his most memorable flight, he didn't pick a day he racked up multiple kills. He picked December 13th, 1943, the mission where he dove into a raid alone, escaped 60-odd enemy planes with a suicide maneuver, and brought Lulu Belle home upside down. In the end, it was 3 minutes, 1 P-40, and a maneuver everyone called suicide that kept a whole valley from burning. This story is drawn from real records, with some dramatization. If you want more forgotten World War II stories, hit like, subscribe, and tell us what we should cover next.